of labor rights and of the sustainability of the planet are the visible face of the transnational capitalism. The other face is not always so visible, but is as impossible, is that of impunity. Impunity of corporate power, the one they have when they vulnerate human rights. It is now 8 years since the collapse of Rana Rasa in Bangladesh, and 1,400 lives were lost in the rubble. But we would rather say in the combination of savage exploitation and total impunity of the textile transnationals who to this day have not retributed the victims and they have not been condemned so that crimes such as the one in Rana Plaza don't happen again. So this is one of many thousands of examples we could mention. And even if denouncing is necessary, it is not enough. It is since years ago that we have several proposals that try to counterbalance the impunity of corporate power. We hear listen references to generic mentioning of human rights or human rights clauses in the commercial treaties and in bilateral agreements as so-called guarantees in order to stop any abuse from transnational corporations or at least to end their impunity. We also have the so-called social corporate responsibility and other mechanisms of self-control by corporations themselves. But the truth of the real existing capitalism is that none of this actually works, and thus we need a really compulsory mechanism that ensure the respect of human rights and which are able to sanction in case of vulneration. In this context, since some months ago in the parliament, a proposal was voted in order to for a directive on due diligence that will be presented by the European Commission very soon. There is no consensus on this proposal, even within the among social organizations or among the left. But I will not develop this issue because it will be the main topic of the debate we will have later. Before I explain the dynamics of this session and I introduce the participants, I will present a quick reflection for debate. When a bit more than a year ago, the current pandemic started, the European Union discovered how, since decades after destroying the production chain in Europe, they found that we were not producing even masks or many other things that were necessary to stop the virus. Given that multinationals had externalized their production chain to the global south, it happens something similar to the externalization of borders in the fortress Europe. In the same way, the fiscal and social laws are externalized. Or so this externalization is an important part of the impunity of corporate power. So the chronic crisis of the profit rate since the 70s has resulted in a push to increase exploitation. And this combined with the lack of mechanisms to control or at least to reduce the vulneration of human rights by multinationals is not a mistake of the system, but it's actually the necessary norm for global capitalism to function. And even then, there is a succession of permanent crises where the abuse and impunity are not exceptions, are actually the engine of capitalism. In the geopolitical context, even more chaotic and conflictive, these dynamics tend to get worse, especially in the comeback since the pandemic. We can see how the vaccines, in the case of the vaccines, how governments are just bowing to the interests of pharmaceutical companies, allowing for contracts that go against all rules of public buys and give total control to private companies. Also, in what concerns the production and distribution of pharmaceutical goods. So if we don't address the issue of the power of transnational companies and of both at the international and local level, we will not address one of the central challenges of our times and of the coming time. And from there, it's clear that discussions like the one that we will have today, they should be useful not only from a point of view of human rights or the global south, which they should be, but they should also be part of a wider discussion that contributes to put this issue in the center of the public agenda, to put the issue, the conflict between capitalism and life, to put it in the center of our public debate. So I don't want to go any longer. We have a limited time. And to speak on all this, we have Manon Aubry. She's a member of the European Parliament and co-president of the left in the European Parliament, who has followed very closely the proposal of the European Parliament, which was voted in March. And we have asked to
recording in progress.
To put this proposal in. Later we will have Erika González, who's a researcher in OMAL, who will present in around 10 minutes the report they have prepared on the issue, giving a general view of the existing mechanisms or the ones that are being discussed, and also the criteria that would be useful to evaluate this importance. Then we will have a roundtable as such, where we have several participants, which I will present, and which will be organized around several questions and proposals, and I will try to chair. So I will now give the floor to Manon. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. Thanks very much, Miguel, for the introduction. Thanks also to all of the NGO representatives being there today, because if you know that issue has been on the agenda for so long and so many years, and you know what I'm talking about, it's only because there's been a bunch of NGOs pushing for it, sometimes when there was no hope, or sometimes where there was no support of any sort from the political level. And it's, to be honest, it's one of the reasons why I engaged myself into politics, because I've been working for NGOs for years, in particular on corporate responsibility, having seen some of the worst human rights abuses in the extractive industry in the DRC, where I've been working for 2 years. And I know, you know, that if we don't end, legally speaking, that impunity that those companies are benefiting from, I know that this will never end, and the Rana Plaza story that you referred to, Miguel, will keep repeating, because since then there have been so many of them. We can talk about thousands of people dying for the buildings for the World Cup in Qatar. We can talk about the Uyghur in China. We can talk about deforestation in Amazonia. Well, just to say that human rights abuses are sort of the norms for most multinationals at the moment. And we know that all of the voluntary initiatives that have been mushrooming over the last couple of years have been completely useless, except then just doing some green and social washing for those big multinational companies. So I'm very happy now to keep up that fight inside the European Parliament, after having seen it from the NGO perspective, and to try to put some more pressure from the inside. And I can tell you that sometimes we feel on our own. That being said, there's still some progress that has been made. So just to give a bit more background of what has happened at the European Parliament, as Miguel has mentioned, I'm sitting in the Legal Affairs Committee that deals with business law. And it's been one of my priorities when I arrived, to try to have an initiative from the Parliament on the matter. As you know, the European Parliament doesn't have any a right of initiative per se, but we have the initiative, and we have the power to write initiative and to write directives that then the Commission has to move forward based on this. So, and we have a limited quota for it. We managed to get adopted the idea of right of initiative on due diligence of multinational corporations when the mandate started, and then we've been working on that report for a couple of months, and it was eventually adopted back early March, I believe. To give you also a bit of background, and I'll get into the details of that proposal, but I think it was a really small window of opportunity that we've managed to have, because I know that the issue has been on for years, and it's been very hard to try to get some progress at European level. But I think there's a big momentum for binding standards, especially when we look at the diversity of national initiative. It's now more than 8 to 9 countries, I believe, in the EU that have initiated a different sort of due diligence, even though it's mostly weak in all countries. And there are cases of abuses that are piling up that I was referring. And of course, there's this social mobilization from organizations, trade unions, associations, and NGOs across the European Union and across the world. So I think there's a huge potential to make progress. Of course, this won't be easy, and I can tell you about some of the backdoors discussion that happened for that report, but still, I think we had the momentum, and I know there's been some debate on whether this can help or weaken the process at the UN level that I've been closely following as well. And I, having seen the negotiation from the inside, having discussed from the EU representative in the negotiations a couple of times, I think the best hope we could have is actually for the EU to have a position and stop hiding the way they've been doing it in the last sessions of negotiations. And for this, for the EU to have a position, and the EU negotiator clearly told it to me, is that we need the EU to have a position at home, so within the EU borders, for them to be able then to defend the UN treaty. So that's why we need to move forward at EU level and hope to push the EU towards more engagement at the UN level. And that's what we're doing. So now about the report. Of course, this is not the final directive the way it looks like, but it sets the ground in terms of the Parliament's position. And we're hoping that the Commission will get as close as possible on that report. The report is not perfect, the proposal is not perfect, but I can tell you, for those of you who've sent the very first draft from the socialist rapporteur, there's still a long way that we've managed to go through, because at the beginning, there was no administrative, no criminal, nor civil liability. So it was very weak on one of the most important aspects of due diligence, which is clearly for victims to be able to access justice. And overall, the position was overall relying on private grievance mechanism operated by the company itself, and we all agree that this is a very big shortcoming. So what we've managed to do in the negotiation that lasted for hours and hours, and it was a big fight, I should say, especially with the right wing, but at times even with the Greens and the SNDs, for them to push in the same direction as us. But we've managed some great progress. First, on the scope, that the proposal includes all large corporations, but also includes those that are based outside the EU, but also includes SMEs, at least the ones which are in high-risk sectors, thinking about the extractive industry. For example, we've also managed to cover all human rights and environment and corruption. That might sound obvious, but they wanted the rights, kept fighting to limit the scope of the human rights, but also to include the entire value chain. And This was a really big fight with the right wing, and they always try to get back to that issue that we need to stop at the first or second layer, second tier, second level of suppliers. And of course, this is the best way for companies to avoid the due diligence strategy, because it would be very easy for them to, include some sort of fake subsidiaries or fake suppliers to get away from their due diligence obligations. We've also made some progress in terms of prevention, because companies have to drop and implement a due diligence strategy. I insist, this is not a mere plan like we have in the French law. This is much wider, with a due diligence strategy that is obviously public, but also monitored by independent public authorities. I know we can have some doubts about the roles of those public authorities, but we can see, for example, in the French experience, clearly what we're lacking is some sort of body with teeth to be able to monitor the implementation of the due diligence. In terms of reparation, we managed to get civil liability, and most importantly, what we've managed to get is the reversal of the burden of the proof, which was a very hard fight, but would mean in practice that it would not be to the victims to prove that they're a victim, but to the company to prove that they've done everything they can to actually prevent human rights abuses. And this is particularly important for victims on the other sides of the world. I'm thinking here about Latin America, obviously, because we have friends from OMAL, but it is true from any sides of the world, and it would be much easier for victims. And we know that it's already very complex to actually take a case to court in the European Union. But then, it's a big change, a big legal change, that it would be up to company to prove that they are not guilty. Then when it comes to sanctions, this was a big fight as well. We managed to get in very last minute of the negotiation a reference to the sanctions that exist in the competition law, which can go up to 10% of the global turnover. The global idea is to try to influence companies and discourage them from doing human rights violations, from what, looking at what they care the most, which is money. So fines in terms of global turnover, but also exclusion from public procurement and state aid. Their operations could be suspended. We could seize their commodities. So there are a lot of tools in terms of administrative sanction. Civil liability, I talked about in terms of reparation. The only thing we did not manage to get, and which is obviously a very important component, that we were, and I have to say, we were the only group fighting for it, the left group in the European Parliament, which is criminal liability for companies and individuals. It is obviously complicated from a legal perspective, because some member states do not recognize such criminal liabilities, but I believe we should still have done it. But there was no majority in the European Parliament on this, and I have to say we were the only ones fighting for it. I don't want to be too long, for taking stock of the proposal. I could also, answer to some of the limitation of that directive. It's clearly it's not a silver bullet directive, and it should definitely completed by other means, fighting against shareholders' dominance, strengthening public means of control over corporation, reinforcing multilateral cooperation of states, reaffirming the primacy of human rights above trade norms, etc. But I think it's really a result that we could not hope for the negotiation, especially when we started the fight at the Parliament, also when we've seen the first draft. And this also has been done thanks to the help, support, and mobilization of organizations and NGOs that have helped us to push into that direction. We know it's not perfect, but still, I do believe that the EU moving in that direction is a long overdue move that we'll have to keep pushing for, especially now that we're waiting for the Commission's proposal that's been delayed. Most likely we're going to get it sometimes early fall, and we'll need your help and your mobilization to push into that direction. And I want to thank on that perspective the work that Friends of the Earth, but also the global coalition has been doing, and the special thanks as well to OMAL for the report that will be presented today, which I think helps putting forward some of the cases, but most importantly, some of the proposals that need to be on top of our list in the fight that we're doing in the European Parliament. Sometimes we feel we're on our own in the European Parliament when we're fighting for those issues, but it's good to see that outside of the European Parliament, there are thousands, hundreds of thousands and millions of people, thousands of victims that are, waiting at last that we end corporate impunity. And this is one of the top priorities of our group that we are fighting for. And I'll stop there because I don't want to be too long. And I thank you very much for the organization of that webinar today, and especially thanks our guests to be with us today.
Muchas gracias, Manon.
Thank you very much, Manon, for this presentation, but also for all the work that you've carried out on this topic. We know that outside of the EP we're not alone, but at the EP we feel alone sometimes. We know what the majorities are like, and I think you've said it really well. There is a majority that is working for impunity of corporate power. And I would also like to excuse Manon because she will have to leave soon. She won't be able to join the debate. But without further ado, I will now give the floor to Erika. You have the floor. Thank you very much. Thank you to everybody who is behind the screen for the interest that you've shown on these talks. And thank you very much for the introduction and the presentation of this topic by Manon and by Miguel. We, of course, need to talk about the impunity of TNCs and the systematic violation of human rights during their activities, as Manon said. We've seen that voluntary instruments that have been approved at the UN have been ineffective, and that means that it's necessary again to approve rules or regulations that are binding for TNCs. This is on the table again. It started in 2014 with the process of establishment a legally binding instrument on transnational cooperation and other business entities at the UN. And more recently, we've seen a communication from the European Commission. They want to approve a directive on due diligence, and in the past few years we've seen different standards and rules that have been approved in several EU countries related to due diligence in the corporate world throughout the supply chain. We see that there are strong challenges in these initiatives. It's really difficult to hold parent companies accountable for violations of human rights that take place throughout the supply chain. These are very fragmented structures, they're very complex, so it's really difficult to hold a parent company accountable for the human rights violation of providers, of contractors, etc., although they are connected. We need to follow the money. We need to follow the profit. And we see that these are the dividends of shareholders. We need to think about how complex the situation is for EU members to adapt their legislation in order to monitor these transnational corporations. These are corporations that operate around the world, and the rights, so to speak, are protected by international law. We have all of these challenges and we have this political and legal context. And yet, for all of the reasons, we thought it would be interesting to introduce this report called Corporations and Human Rights, and we have a look at the different initiatives on this topic. We also propose a theoretical framework with 10 key ideas, with 10 proposals that we hope to include in international law. And we also look at some of the initiatives that are international and national in nature. I would like to focus on these 10 key points that we think are essential in any rule on TNCs and human rights to make sure they are efficient. These 10 key points have been created owing to the work of many social organizations and communities that have been affected by TNCs. And this is all part of a global campaign called Dismantling Corporate Power. I also wanted to elaborate briefly on these 10 ideas so that we can bring them into the debate. We can think about whether they've been incorporated to this proposal and to what extent. We've got a proposal on the table of what this new directive might look like. And we can think of any sort of regulation or standard. We want to make sure the scope is focused on transnational corporations. Like I said, these are complex and fragmented corporations, so it's really difficult to control, monitor their activities with regards to human rights. They are legally fragmented and they can operate around the world, and that means we have no tools to force them to abide by international laws. We've seen a lot of deregulation in member states, and this is due to neoliberal policies. So we need specific instruments for these corporations. Secondly, we want to push for binding rules over voluntary agreements. We've seen how ineffective these voluntary agreements have been. We've seen we need new rules, new international obligations. That is the key word, obligations. So corporations have to respect human rights. Third, we also need to reinforce the primacy of human rights for trade and commercial treaties. International law, international human rights law is a set of rules, of laws that are imperative. We can look at the Vienna Convention and we can see that these overarching rules cannot be contravened or derogated by other rules that are not imperative. And trade rules are non-imperative. Therefore, we need to reinforce the primacy of human rights over trade and commercial rules. Fourth, we need to spell out the extraterritorial obligations of these companies. There is an obligation, and states have the obligation to protect human rights. And if they don't do this, they are failing their international responsibility on an international scale. Fifth, we need to include the responsibility and the accountability of national and international organizations. That means thinking of the decision made by the European Central Bank or other international financial organizations such as the World Bank. We need to think of their policies that create legal armor And in 10, that means states create policies that create impunity for human rights violations. Therefore, we need to reinforce the responsibility of national and international organizations in the light of TNCs and their activities. 6, we need to include this double international responsibility. Manon mentioned this wasn't included in the resolution by the EU, and it's likely will also be out in the directive. We need to hold senior management accountable because they have designed the strategy to increase profits by violating human rights. We need to hold them accountable, the senior management, but also we need to hold accountable the whole structure that facilitates this strategy. We need to go after this legal figure as well. We need to take them to court on a civil and, of course, on a criminal way, if possible. We also need to make progress in terms of enforceability, justiciability, and transparency. We need to have mandatory measures, otherwise, and of course, we also need to have something that holds accountable institutions so that these mandatory measures can be respected. We also need to have a specific court. We think this is key to put a halt to impunity. 8th, we want to facilitate access to justice and remedy. Communities that have been affected need to have access to reparation because otherwise human rights are violated in the practice. It doesn't make sense. We need to guarantee this access to justice and remedy. We've seen in some cases that you could do a class act, or you could do a class action, or you could pay for the legal fees. There are different ways to make sure there's access to justice and to remedy. In 9th place, we want to foster the participation of all social actors in the creation, the application, and the monitoring of these rules. Social actors are directly affected by these human rights violations at the hands of TNCs. Therefore, they need to be present. I'm talking about trade unions, human rights organizations, feminism, environmental groups, etc. And last, in 10th place, we would like to incorporate external assessment mechanisms. There must be some mechanism to assess if the goals are being achieved or if changes are necessary. We need to have accountability. If the goals are not being met, who is responsible for that? And how can we hold them accountable? We need to look at this. How can we solve this lack of efficacy? These are the 10 key points I wanted to present. I don't know if there might be any questions later in the debate. And I will try to show them on the screen later in case there are any questions about any of them, or there are any comments or any contributions on these 10 key aspects that we think should be a part of any regulations related to the obligations on TNCs regarding human rights. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Erika. La verdad es que como nos tenemos que intentar
Thank you, Erika. We are short on time. We're going to have a round table with our speakers. We're hoping to have 3 rounds. We're going to start with 2. We'll also have a row 0 with questions, and I would like to encourage you to ask questions if you like. You can start now on the chat on YouTube so that we can compile these questions to the ones asked by row 0. And without further ado, I will give the floor to our speakers in our roundtable. First of all, we've got Raffaele Morgantini, Advocacy Officer, representative of CETIM. Apologies if I don't pronounce your last names in the best way, says Miguel. We also have Jill D. McArdle, Corporate Accountability Campaigner of Friends of the Earth Europe. And then we've got Pedro Ramiro, researcher at OMAL. We envisage 5 minutes per person. And I would ask you that we stick to a time limit. The first question would be, in the following order, what are the strengths and the weaknesses? What are the pros and cons of the European proposal that we have been talking about? Rafael, you are first. Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Miguel, and thank you to the rest of organizers of this very relevant event. Timely too. We've got this proposal for a European directive. I think Jill and Pedro will be able to talk more in detail about this proposal, so I won't do that. I work more with the binding treaty, so maybe during the second round I can tell you more about it and about our challenges in that respect. Talking about a European proposal, what can I say? I would like to add the following. What are the challenges and the implications of this directive for future processes at the UN on the legally binding instrument? Of course, this directive could be a risk. The EU could use this process, this draft, for a directive as an argument to undermine the international process for the legally binding instrument. Maybe we could say that the UN process is no longer necessary, or it could be a way to water down the content. And that would put an end to the possibility of having a legally binding instrument for the international community. We could be positive that the directive is going to be used as a tool one way or another on an international level. We can hope that the future directive, we can expect that it will be less than what we would hope it, basically, because it's based on a concept of due diligence, which is limited by its nature. Regulating corporations through due diligence is not related to human rights respect, but rather to the obligation of updating and elaborating risk plans, risk management plans. And that's why we think that focusing on due diligence and accountability throughout the value chain, sanctions, monitoring, legal liability, focusing on all that means focusing on risk plans that are made up by the companies themselves. This is not the way. We would like to go beyond this concept. If we don't, we will have due diligence that is already in the guiding principles and the OECD framework. These are voluntary. And we're talking about mandatory due diligence with air quotes. We think this is more a way to guarantee future investments more than anything else. There's something that's even more worrying. That concept will move from the EU scope to the international sphere in order to water down the level of ambition of the international process. And this is already taking place. We see it already. Let's not forget that there have been due diligence initiatives in Europe and around the world over the past few years, and all these processes have had an influence on the UN process. The member states try to use the content of these initiatives to influence the negotiation at the UN. And this is what the EU has been doing and will continue to do. We can see it at the UN. That means national due diligence processes are a sort of excuse to release their obligation to negotiate in good faith, because they say they've already got national provisions. Last week, we were in an informal consultation on the binding instrument, and the EU talked about this directive as a legal reference framework. Ecuador was leading the negotiations. They also mentioned a law, and other countries did the same. And we expect to see that in the coming months. And let's not forget, and I'll close with this, we need to look at the relationship between these two processes on an international level in the EU. The draft treaty that is being discussed at the UN already include rules that focus on due diligence. Article 6 on prevention, Article 8 on accountability. They are based on due diligence.
De los derechos humanos, es necesario elaborar disposiciones que van más allá de este concepto, incluyendo obligaciones directas para las transnacionales y mecanismos que extiendan la responsabilidad legal a lo largo de las cadenas de producción y mecanismos de implementación efectiva y de sanción en caso de no cumplimiento. Y entonces lo que hemos estado proponiendo como campaña en el marco del proceso internacional será lo mismo que vamos a tener que exigir de la ley europea. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Rafael. Sin más, le damos la palabra a Gil.
I think that was passed to me, was it? Yes? Okay, great. Hello, I hope you can hear me okay. Thanks for having me. Yes, I'm Jill from Friends of the Earth Europe. So we have been working here in Europe on the EU due diligence legislation and also working in the global campaign on the UN treaty process. So trying to keep both processes working going forward. So if we're supposed to reflect on the Parliament report, I think it's important to notice that the Parliament report that we're talking about it's just one of many positions that the Commission will take into consideration when it makes its proposal. So I think it's important to understand it, but to know that that's the role that it plays. And I think it's a bit more important that we talk about very clearly what needs to be in, if the EU wants to do a corporate accountability legislation, what needs to be in it. And there's a lot in the European Parliament report. So I will talk a bit about what we want to see in an EU law and reflect a bit on what the Parliament report has, but mostly it's about what we demand the Commission to do. There is more in the report than I think just the due diligence plan. There is fundamentally in there the and what we demand, the obligation to respect human rights, to respect the environment, and to have proper enforcement, so proper consequences for companies that don't do this in their global operations and in their global value chains. So for that reason, I think the European Parliament report, it's not perfect, like Manon said, but it has some key things there that get across the message that this is about a lot more than a due diligence process. And so that's why I think it's important. We really insist on the due diligence duty to be about establishing an effective obligation. So I think this is something that we always need to communicate. It's not about just the process, but it's about the impact and the results. And that it's always accompanied by transnational access to justice, by victims' rights, and especially the transnational element, because we in the EU have all of the companies that are evading justice around the world in their subsidiaries and in their subcontractors and further down in their value chain. So this is the message that we always try to bring at the EU level, that it has to come with judicial remedy. Again, this is something in the Parliament report that I think there, as Manon said, there was very strong focus on the grievance mechanisms. And now it's a bit less, but there's still, I would say, a bit too much focus on grievance mechanisms and not enough focus, although there is there, on the judicial remedy. I think the report is good in saying that if you have grievance mechanism and non-judicial remedy, this cannot get in the way of the victim's right to go to an independent court to seek justice, that is a right that affected communities have and that cannot be impacted by grievance mechanisms. I think it could be stronger, but it is there, and this is something we expect the Commission to take on board. And I think that's really crucial to take on the power imbalances that we see. That I agree with everything that has been said, that you don't really want the self-regulation of companies. You want to empower communities to be able to legally challenge and take on those corporations. So this is some of the things that are in the report that we also demand. At Friends of the Earth, we have obviously worked for a long time on this court case against Shell, well, a couple of court cases against Shell. One that was just this week on climate change, but then also a few months ago, they had a victory, our colleagues in the Netherlands, to get compensation for victims of oil spills in Nigeria. That took 13 years though, and it showed some of the big problems we have in the EU that we try to address in EU law, like the parent company and supply chain liability, which is in the Parliament report, but it's not everything we would want to see, but it is mentioned there, and we think that's really important because it gives the political signal to the Commission that they need to include it as well, but they definitely need to improve on what is there. It's also, we would also like to see, and this is harder to do in this legislation, but it's something that we insist on, is fixing the jurisdictional and applicable law rules, the international private law rules that govern transnational court cases. It's hard to fit this all into a due diligence law, and I think that's why Manon said as well, it's not a silver bullet. We're not going to get everything that we need to do for access to justice in the EU in this. But we will try to get some of the provisions like on applicable law included in this legislation. But it's a really tough fight to do that because it's, it might actually change things. So it's quite controversial. there's also, I think she mentioned the burden of proof, and I think that's a really, really important one. That's going to be a really big fight. It is mentioned in the Parliament report. I don't think it's strong enough. It's not in the key legislative text. We really need to, especially on the causation, which is so hard to prove for victims who don't have access to documents in court cases. So that's a really important one as well that I think could be a lot stronger in the Parliament report, and we insist on. I will stop talking in a minute because I probably said enough, but I would just say that I also agree that on the risks of the due diligence legislation. And so while we try to get some good things in there, we also try to make sure that it is not going to make anything worse, that it is not a box ticking exercise. So again, it is about the impact, it is about the results, it's not about the process. This is something we insist on. And that it cannot create any immunity from liability. And that goes in two ways. So victims must still be able to go to court, even if a company did the due diligence. Victims still have the right to claim compensation. Those two things are completely independent of each other, and we need to make that. I think that's something we need to really work on in the EU to make sure that those two don't, due diligence doesn't undermine. And that it improves it instead. And also where there is a crime or a very egregious harm, these are like criminal serious offenses, there is definitely, companies cannot argue that because they did the due diligence plan that they are not responsible for crimes or other very serious things. So these are some risks that we have to watch as well. But it's not over yet, so we're still trying.
Muchas gracias, Gil. Le voy a dar paso a Pedro y nada, sin más, Pedro.
Vale, pues por mi parte 3 ideas en esta.
Thank you. I want to put forward 3 ideas in this first round. First thing is that this directive process of the European Union or of the European Commission, we understand it comes since the guiding principles. So it's the evolution, judicial development of the guiding principles. There has been another line at an international level which has to do with binding rules, with strong rules. This is a debate that exists since the 70s, since the Center and Commission on Transnational Companies in the United Nations, and which has restarted in 2014 with the proposal of Ecuador and South Africa, and supported by the majority of the Human Rights Council of the European Union, and which gives birth to the 26/9 resolution of the European Union. That is the strong line, and then you have the other line of the corporate social responsibility, voluntary agreements, guiding principles since 2011. And now we understand that there's an evolution of this whole idea of due diligence. Let's not forget that this due diligence concept comes as a proposal from Professor Raleigh in the guiding principles, as it was voted by the United Nations in 2011. And of course, the European Union comes in this second line. Why should I say that it's a sort of juridical development of this idea? Because it appears as a sort of advance in terms of voluntary actions, but in fact, we are always discussing about the resolution proposal voted by the European Parliament. This is not yet the rule of the European Commission. It will probably be cut down. So we are discussing this proposal, the one that has been voted by the European Parliament. And in this here, all what we have is plans of risk evaluation that are presented by the enterprise itself. So it is not really a public audit, public control. It is more like a private audit rather than a public inspection. So it has to do with corporate unilaterality, a plan that they present, and on top, in response to that, we can ask for things. So it is, of course, a small advance, a minor advance. Well, second idea, given the current situation, the seriousness of the current situation, the regulation in favor of corporate power, there are rules that are being created actually to favor the big companies, new commercial agreements, new rules which have to do with public contracts using the condition of the European funds. So in fact, the advances in terms of human rights compared with this are very, very weak. It's a sort of soft version, whereas we have the strong version in terms of commercial law. So we cannot have, on the one side, this very strong law in favor of these very strong laws in favor of multinational companies, and counterposed to that, a very weak human rights law. So these whole laws that are adapted to social, what we have actually is a sort of proposal, an orientation, a suggestion for what the company should present in their plans. The framework, say, is that of a law which is very much for corporate power. The whole thing with this proposal, it is not really effective. They are compulsory laws as the Paris Agreement was in 2015. It is supposed to be binding. It really binds every country which signs it. But what are they forced to do? Well, they have to present a plan. 5 years later, they have to say how they will reduce their emissions. They don't say how they will do it or whatever. Now we are talking about some compulsiveness for corporations to present a plan to reduce the risk, to overlook their supply chain. But what happens if this is interrupted? Let's give an example just to finish with this round. Let's suppose what happens with Inditex if they present a risk plan, which is perfectly right, very properly done by a private audit company, which does a very nice job. And then in an illegal workshop in Tanger, Morocco, there is a flooding and there are 28 workers who drown. It's not something that I'm inventing. It's actually something that happened in February. Could we, with this European legislation, ask for the main company, Inditex, to be condemned or prosecuted because they have the risks or actually cause the lives of the workers because they were looking for maximum profit and reducing the labor conditions? Well, our understanding is it would be very difficult under this plan. We understand that in the current relationship of forces, it is not easy to go further because you have against you all the lobbies and so on. But if you want our evaluation from the social organization, we understand that this is clearly very improvable. Thank you very much. Well, we don't have so much time. We have to finish at 12:30. So what I will propose now is that we go to our guests, who will do very brief interventions. Of course, I invite you to present your questions, and then we will have a second round of this roundtable, for which we had already a question put forward, but you might comment also on other interventions that will come. So first, Erika Mendez.
Thank you. I will speak in English if that's okay. So thank you very much, and thanks for the presentation so far. It's been really interesting. My question goes a bit, well, so I've been working on the UN treaty process for the past few years, and also following the EU due diligence initiative with some concerns. And my question goes a bit to the point of the relationship between these two processes, a bit in line also with what Raffaele was putting. So we have been witnessing this massive mobilization from all regions of the world every year, every session, and between the sessions to demand a strong and effective UN treaty on transnational corporations and human rights. So we have been seeing these hundreds of groups, labor unions, civil society, feminists, peasants, and people that are directly affected by transnational corporations' activities that have been articulating their demands, bringing their expertise in the first person. And these experiences are really the real expertise that we need to look at in terms of what needs to be contained in a future UN treaty in order to really be able to remove obstacles to access justice and to hold companies accountable for human rights violation. So I wanted to ask if when we look at the EU due diligence initiative, I wanted to ask if you think that the EU would be interested or aiming at having this level of engagement, including from affected peoples from the global south, people that have been impacted by the activities of European transnational corporations, when framing and having these discussions towards this due diligence initiative. Would it be, in your opinion, do you think it would be possible to have this level of engagement, and would the EU be open and interested to this, or rather would it be more likely that we see this debate happening mostly within the EU and more of a high level debate that will probably impact what comes out of this due diligence law will then impact other jurisdictions? So my question will be in terms of what can we expect of the participation of especially affected peoples, grassroots organizations in the discussions for this due diligence initiative. Thank you.
Gracias, Erika. Le doy paso a Ana
Thank
María.
you, Erika. I will now give the floor to Maria Suarez from FIAM. Thank you very much to all panelists. Your presentations were very interesting. I want to connect to what Erika said. In Europe, a regulation is adopted, and that means that has an impact on the world. This is not just about a European directive. This is a European directive that will influence legal procedures in other regions, in the Global South particularly. This has happened since the colonies. And in this respect, we think there is a risk. If the scope is too reduced, that means this could have an effect on standards that are stronger in the Global South. For instance, the assessment we carried out in Brumadinho case in Brazil, we saw that there is objective responsibility, strict liability. Strict liability, that means that we don't take into account the negligence of the company. If they work in a risky activity, they are liable unless there's force majeure. If there is due diligence that only thinks about the means and not the results, and that is imposed on Brazil, that means our protection could go down. We've also seen that there is social liability or criminal liability that is recognized in some countries, and this is not the case in the directive. Second point, in the same context, one of the most symbolic effects of the directive, if it's reduced to diligence, is the following. We could reduce the debate that is taking place on a global level on CSR. And it goes beyond everything that has been mentioned by Erika and Jill. And if we only regulate regions rather than countries, that will create an imbalance in the international law. There will be a human rights dumping. That means companies will go where the standards are lower. And to conclude, I have a question for Erika. In FIAM, we've seen that the main challenge goes beyond transnational corporations, because we have networks that include business units that are not officially part of TNCs. For instance, pension plans in Europe are contributing to land grabbing, and they're not part of a TNC, and yet they're part of a global business network that would not even be recognized within the value chain. How do you look at this if you only work with TNCs? I would also talk about future generations. In general, we have an expiry dates of 20, 30 years. We've seen that with pesticides, impacts show up in the following generation. So it means we need to start counting since there is awareness of the harm done. Have you considered this in your proposal? And finally, nobody has talked about corporate capture, but we know this is one of the main challenges that we've got on business and human rights. We know that Europe and other industrialized countries and regions are in favor of multilateralism, and they put everybody on the same boat without recognizing that we have a different nature and purposes. How do you think this should be regulated? Thank you. Thank you very much, Ana Maria. This is really interesting. We also have 2 questions from our audience. I will read them now. From Homa Brazil. They want to know if there are any Spanish projects with the support of the civil society on due diligence, and what is the substance? I don't know if Pedro can tell us more about this. Erika has introduced this to an extent. Alejandro de Pablo wants to know if this European proposal implies suing the parent company in another country if they had effective control. These would be the questions that we have received from row 0. And we also have the overarching question from our roundtable for this last round. Beyond the differences that we've heard about today regarding EU legislation, what could be commonalities so we can move forward together? We don't have a lot of time, unfortunately, so I would ask you to be brief, stick to 5 minutes, and I will show you a phone to signal that you've gone over your 5 minutes. I will not be cutting your microphone off. I said that, but it was a joke. Apologies. We will start, if you don't mind, with Pedro. And we will reverse the order we had before. Okay. So what we think a rule that creates consensus should include would look a lot like the consensus or the majority that created Resolution 26.9 in the UN. This would be an international regulation that fills the gap for TNCs that cannot be controlled by these national actors. That was the point of this resolution 26/9. They focus on TNCs because there is no legislation on a national level to control a company that has a parent company in Madrid, a shell company in the Netherlands, has a tax haven in Cayman Island, and also has a subsidiary in Colombia. So what do we do? What legislation do we use? With the guiding principle and with the progress that we've made with due diligence, with this proposal, we think this loophole is not covered. There are no new obligations in international law, so that there are the same mandatory standards for companies anywhere in the world. So, in our global campaign, what we propose in the report that Erika has introduced is a framework of 10 key points. We want to regulate obligations for legal people, not just for management, for natural people, but we want to look at legal figures, private figures, companies. We need to monitor them, we need to inspect them. That needs to be a public and a citizen inspection with trade unions, with social organizations. So companies present their plans, of course, but then governments, social, environmental organizations, etc., hold them accountable. And if they don't, there will be a body that will come up with a solution and that will point out these human rights violations. We need real progress in enforceability. With this directive, we don't think we could sue a company because of human rights violations in a third country. We could talk about the risk plan, but not on the usual modus operandi. We need more engagement from citizens and citizen participation. We need institutions to control these companies. Let's talk about examples in the Spanish state. I think we can find some inspiration in the resolution 26/9 of the UN. It's a process that unfortunately has become watered down over the years, that is getting closer to due diligence, but it would be interesting to go back to this, the spirit of this resolution. And also we could also get inspiration from the spirit of this French law that we present in our report. And in this first draft, it reflected a lot of the demands from civil society, Friends of the Earth, etc. We also have the Swiss initiative that has failed in a referendum in 2020. We think it's a very good initiative, actually. It wanted to safeguard in the constitution the extraterritorial obligations of the companies. That means companies have to be held accountable in third countries as they are in Switzerland. And to do that, they needed to modify the constitution. The votes said yes, but then the Swiss regions said no. So it failed, but it was very positive. There's a third example, and it's the Catalan example in our report. At the moment, there's a draft law pending approval in the Catalonian Parliament. At the moment, it's pending, but it was actually approved during the last term. We approved a law last term that social organizations have been fighting for years, so that there is a public center with participation of all social actors that holds companies accountable on their impact on human rights. These three examples, France, Switzerland and Catalonia are a good example to follow, rather than this proposal from the EEP that is going to be further down, watered down by the Commission in the following months, I have no doubt. Thank you very much, Raffaele. Go ahead. Oh, I thought it was Jill. I thought Jill was up next. It doesn't matter. Jill, go ahead. As you wish.
Okay, thanks. So I would reply on some points on the treaty that were made, and like Erika's question as well. And I will try to reply on, there was a couple of questions and points about suing parent companies. And I am not 100% sure I fully understood the questions, but I think the questions were like, is it possible to sue parent companies in third countries, like, or in the EU? Or would it be possible under these new legal proposals? So this is something that I said earlier. And again, there's what's in the, let's see what's in the European Parliament reports. But I think it's really much more important talk about what we want now, and then we will see in September, October, when we get the Commission proposal, how far away it is. You know, it's likely not going to be that close to what we want, but we have some months left to keep pushing them. So to sue parent companies, what is in the European Parliament report, so the positive things in there is that there is this in the liability, in civil liability, there is a liability of EU companies for controlled companies. And what is included is also this rebuttal presumption of control. So this would mean that if it's a company in the supply chain, that there is some evidence that the EU company can control. They don't necessarily have to be controlling, but they could control it. They could be liable for harms connected to that company. And it would be on them, the burden would be on them to prove that they don't control that company. So this would be an improvement. And the other thing that we would like to see, which is not so strong in the Parliament report, is the reversal of the burden of proof on causation. This is the one law that we do have in Europe, the French devoir de vigilance, the big thing that's missing, that the NGOs really pushed for and they didn't get, and there was a big business lobby there as well, was the reversal of the burden of proof on causation. And that's what we really need as well to then make those cases more likely to succeed. But for the parent company to be sued in the EU for harms abroad, yes, that is something that we expect to see in the legislation. There's a lot of pieces that have to go in to make it work really well, but overall we do expect to see that there. That should be an option, and the Commission does understand that that is one of the things that is needed to connect to due diligence. Just the other thing on, I think just Erika's point was very good on whether we need global voices in the EU debate. We definitely do. We definitely do. We need to keep reminding people in the EU, whether it is the decision maker or some of the NGOs, you know, that it's not just about company processes. You know, it's not just about writing out all the ways that we would like to see companies do due diligence, but it's really about the impacts on the ground, and we can always be reminded of that, and always to remind that due diligence is not the only thing, that there's a lot more we can do, and historically due diligence is just one thing and maybe not even the best solution. I think those are really important perspectives that people who've been working on corporate accountability across the globe can bring to this discussion. The only caution is that to communicate in the EU, we need to speak in a way and to communicate to European decision makers in a way that they can understand. You know, if I'm blunt, they're used to getting position papers written by Brussels-based NGOs who all communicate in the same way. So when we see papers from elsewhere, they don't often understand the framework and the thinking, and it's not clear to them what's being asked or what's being demanded. So that's just like a fundamental issue that we have to overcome to get more mutual understanding. It's something we've been trying to do in Friends of the Earth with CIDSE and others. to have more webinars where we kind of can talk through the backgrounds to everybody's thinking and exchange more so that we start to understand better everyone's starting points. And I think we realize more that we have more and more in common in what we seek and ask for when we do that. But there is a bit of work there so everybody understands each other well. Yeah, I will stop there.
Sí, muchas gracias. Entonces, hablando de entendimientos, consensos comunes, no voy a decir nada en ese sentido porque creo que Pedro lo dijo todo, y para mí los entendimientos son justamente esos 10 puntos desarrollados en el informe de OMAL, ¿no? Sin embargo, me gustaría añadir algo sobre la relación, los enlaces entre los dos procesos, ¿no? El europeo y el internacional.
I would like to say a couple of words on the international relationships. We need to look at how the treaty process and the EU process is articulated. I see 3 key factors. We've got content, substance. We need to think of the content of the substance of this future proposal we are waiting for. And this is going to influence the articulation of 2 processes, because the more watered down it is, the more dangerous this is for the UN, because the EU will be able to use this watered down proposal to influence our process at the UN. Then we need to look at the second factor, which is states. We're thinking about the state of Ecuador, who is leading the process. And this is going to be key. We've got a new government, the Lasso government, and we are yet to see how this new government is going to relate to Brussels and how they will welcome the European demands and the demands of the European Commission, and of course the member states' demands. So we will have to see how this work goes. And third, we have the factor of social organizations. How are we going to work together to link both processes, to articulate them in order to have our demands met? We need to look at the impact of the EU process on the treaty process. And this will depend on the correlations of strengths. And this depends on our capacity as progressive forces to influence both processes at the same time. And that's why we need to look at both processes as complementary, so we can articulate both of them to meet our demands. It is really important to create understanding and to have common strategies between organizations and progressive forces in both processes through a coordinated approach. Otherwise, it will be very difficult to win this battle. And if you allow me, I would like to briefly talk about the current situation of this international treaty at the UN so that we can have a common understanding on the challenges. We need this common understanding for these common strategies. On the past October, we had the 6th round of negotiations of the working group at the UN. They are negotiating the binding instrument. After 6 years, they finally introduced second draft of the treaty. So this has been a long time coming, and the different parts are starting to get a bit antsy because they want this treaty to become a reality. We have the powerful countries and businesses that are scared of this treaty because it could question impunity and the profits of the political and economic elites.
para un tratado, en definitiva, vaciado de su contenido, un tratado, le decimos, sin dientes, ¿no? Y por el otro lado,
a treaty that is completely empty, that, as we say, has no tooth. So, and on the other hand, the representatives of social movements, of progressive governments, and of the global South are afraid of having a completely empty treaty, which just refers to voluntary action. So this is why we continue to work in favor of an ambitious treaty that might really handle the legal challenges on this issue. So in this sense, we see in the United Nations, we are in a critical moment, in a very tense moment, in a phase where actually we are starting to speak out concrete issues. And another element that is making the process even more tense is that it is not clear, nothing is clear about the timeline. We could go on for years, or we might close it next year. And this makes it also uncertain. And so on our side, the challenge is to find a balance between the need to go quick to adopt a treaty, because the affected communities really do need it, but at the same time, to make sure that the content of the treaty might actually help and thus be useful for the communities that are on the ground and who are suffering from human rights violations. And here we have another important element, and that's that the current situation of the process, where we are very critical with it, because for the international community, there's a real risk to have a very weak treaty, a treaty would have been emptied, which would not take into account the 10 points that the OMAL report put forward. In our view, a quick adoption of a bad treaty would be disastrous. It would actually end the whole international debate around this issue. We will have the treaty, and therefore we just have to go back home. So we are in a critical moment, and the real challenge is to give this this fight in terms of content and lobbying towards the states and so on. And to finish, I would like to underline that for our strategy of lobbying and pressuring the states in order to have an effective tool, we have to find some agreement, and we cannot ignore, as activists against corporate impunity, we cannot forget about the political battle at a national level, because that's where actually the biggest actions are held. And if we don't participate of the struggle to bring progressive change also at a national level, if we don't do that, then the multinational struggle, international struggle, will be much harder. And I think this is very important, a very important thing to agree on. And I will leave it there. Thank you very much. So thank you, everybody. Thank you to other participants and everybody who has been following this discussion from several countries, not only from Europe. We can really say we've had an international discussion. And I think it's very interesting to comment on something that Rafa was mentioning, is to see, we shouldn't see the relationship of forces in the institutions as a fixed situation. We have to take into account the capacity of social movements to pressure and to change. It is clear that the current situation, it's not favorable to the interest of the social majorities, but I think we really can put pressure, and this is what we can do. We have to go back to what Pedro was saying of having strong legislation that really puts real pressure in corporate power and ends impunity. Well, Of course, we could go on. There are other questions, but we don't have more time. I hope this has been useful, and we also engage after summer to organize a similar activity to this one that allows us to debate, but also to advance in initiatives and to pressure against this corporate pressure. Well, thank you very much, and see you soon.
Ya estamos fuera de la emisión.
Listo.
Gracias.
Gracias.
Muchas gracias.
Bueno, gracias, Peña.
Muchas gracias a las traductoras que se han pegado ahí la paliza.
Sí.
Eso.
Gracias.
Russo and Company y traductoras, gracias.
Eso es Russo Company, que debe estar a 40 pantallas ahí, todo estresado.